listener production.
When they took a shot at my hero and they tried to kill the next president of the United States, enough was enough. And I said, let Trumpomania run wild, brother. Let Trumpomania rule again. Let Trumpomania make America great again.
Hey, Bension here, and that was the pro wrestler Hulk Hogan at the Republican National Convention about an hour ago as we record this. It was one of the more unhinged moments in what has been one of the most batshit crazy weeks we have ever seen in US politics. There was the attempted assassination of Trump at a rally over the weekend. Then we had the Republican National Convention, otherwise known as Conservative Christmas, where Trump named J.D. Vance as his running mate. What a turnaround for a guy who once referred to Trump as America's Hitler. And then the main event, moments ago, Donald Trump showing a side of himself that we've never really seen before in a speech accepting the Republican nomination for President of the United States. And meanwhile, US President Joe Biden has been diagnosed with COVID, and the drumbeat of Democrats calling for him to withdraw, including now former President Barack Obama behind closed doors, has only grown louder. To make sense of it all, joining us from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee is Dave Levinthal, Editor-in-Chief of Raw Story. Dave, thanks so much for joining us once again on The Briefing. There's so much to cover, but let's start with Donald Trump's speech that's just happened. He was expressing emotions, talking about uniting the country rather than retribution. This is a very different message than we've heard from Donald Trump.
It was in many respects, and of course this is all coming just days after an assassination attempt where Donald Trump was quite literally a few millimeters away between life and death. And here he was on the stage here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in front of throngs of very well-wishing and great loving supporters, and really the people who are the core of his base, the most MAGA of MAGAites, if you will. And he put on quite a show for him, not just Donald Trump, but all the other speakers today. But yes, this was a subdued Donald Trump relative to what we expect from him. This is somebody who at times was even talking in hushed tones, barely audible.
So many people have asked me, what happened? Tell us what happened, please. And therefore, I will tell you exactly what happened. And you'll never hear it from me a second time because it's actually too painful to tell.
And his message, too, was different. It was much less red meat and much more self-reflection, which is, again, typically what we do not get from Donald Trump. But the extraordinary circumstances that we're in right now and that he is in personally are obviously the driver of that.
I am running to be president for all of America, not half of America, because there is no victory in winning for half of America. So tonight, with faith and devotion, I proudly accept your nomination for President of the United States. Thank you.
We got these messages about unity and also some sort of emotional tones from Trump following this assassination attempt, but we did hear some familiar themes, especially about immigration.
Absolutely. And mind you, this was a speech that, first and foremost, was one of the longest acceptance speeches for a presidential nomination in modern American political history. The American Presidency Project, which is based out of the University of California at Santa Barbara, put out a statistic saying that it was the longest since at least 1956. And Donald Trump, in that respect, covered a great deal of ground. And he definitely played some of his old hits. He talked about immigration and laying out a policy that many Americans consider to be just patently draconian.
Has anyone seen Silence of the Lambs? The late, great Hannibal Lecter. He'd love to have you for dinner. That's insane asylums. They're emptying out their insane asylums. And terrorists are coming in at numbers that we've never seen before.
And he talked a lot about all sorts of other issues, ranging from jobs and the economy to the way that he would handle international affairs that were quintessentially Trump. Hardly anything new. And policies that are very, very much in diametric opposition to what about half of America would want. So in that respect, as Donald Trump is talking about unity, you really got to consider that in two veins. Number one, unity throughout America. This was not a unifying speech in any respect in that regard, just given the divisions in this country and how many people fundamentally disagree with what Donald Trump had to say today. But it was a very unifying speech for the Republican Party, which had gone through sort of its own internal divisions during its primary process when Donald Trump was facing off against other candidates who kind of slowly dropped out, and one remained, Nikki Haley, who dropped out in the end. And he really has just wiped away any of that division.
As long as our energies are spent fighting each other, our destiny will remain out of reach, and that's not acceptable. We must instead take that energy and use it to realize our country's true potential and write our own thrilling chapter of the American story. We can do it together. We will unite. We are going to come together, and success will bring us together.
Dissenters for Donald Trump would note that Donald Trump, when he talks about unity, well, that's unity for people who get on board. It's not unity for people who dissent. They're cast away. So take it in whatever spirit you will, but America remains a very divided country still, all the same, after this speech tonight.
Absolutely. The other big news we heard out of the convention was, of course, Trump naming J.D. Vance as his candidate for vice president. Many of our listeners would have probably heard that name for the first time this week. What is the main thing that we need to know about him?
J.D. Vance has had a very meteoric rise in the past 10 years. It first started and launched by his book, Hillbilly Elegy, which vaulted to the top of the bestseller list here in the United States. He has quite an incredible personal story about how he really did the ultimate rags to riches American dream process of having very little, if anything at all, growing up to now being quite literally a heartbeat away from the presidency if Donald Trump were to be elected in November. So he is a U.S. Senator, a recently elected U.S. Senator, should note, and somebody who is very popular in his state of Ohio, but many Americans who are not Republicans view with skepticism.
Every now and then, I will get a call from a relative back home who asks, "Did you know so-and-so?" And I'll remember a face from years ago, and then I'll hear they died of an overdose. As always, America's ruling class wrote the checks. Communities like mine paid the price.
He's also not that much of a known commodity across the United States. Again, he's known in his own home state. He's had a certain amount of profile, but it's not as if he's been a U.S. Senator who has been serving for 20 or 30 years, who has sought the presidency before on his own terms. And in that respect, he's definitely somebody who is going to have to introduce himself to Americans beyond just what he did this week, which was give his own acceptance speech for the vice presidency. So, but I would temper that by saying that the vice presidency, a lot is made of it. There's a lot of parlor games played about who's going to be the selection, who's Donald Trump going to choose, or who is any presidential candidate going to choose. But really, they are there to support the president. The president or the presidential candidate is the one who really, truly matters. And that's just simply the reality of the way that the American presidential political system works.
On the other side of politics, in the past 24 hours, of course, US President Joe Biden has been diagnosed with COVID-19, and details of conversations with top Democrats, including Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi, have been leaked. How big a deal is it now that it seems Obama is no longer backing Biden?
This is an absolutely catastrophic development for Joe Biden's candidacy. Right now, it ranges somewhere between listing dramatically and outrightly sunk. And Joe Biden has said all throughout today, in fact, went to an availability with his campaign this morning here in Milwaukee, where I am. You can probably still hear the convention noise in the background. And they said, no, he's staying in the race. He is not leaving. He is going to be the nominee of the Democratic Party. But even within the 12 hours subsequent, there were numerous other high-profile Democrats who either said straight up, Joe Biden needs to pass the torch and he needs to step back and not stand for re-election, or others who were openly questioning whether Joe Biden was mentally and physically fit to serve another 4 years, which, mind you, Joe Biden would be 86 years old on the final day of a second term after 4 years in 2029. And if Joe Biden is struggling in the ways that he is right now, that we have all been able to objectively see with our own eyes, the question is, well, what kind of a president is he going to be? What shape is he going to be in come 4 years from now? And that's the question that the Democratic Party has been wrestling with for more than 3 weeks, ever since Joe Biden had what by all measures was a disastrous debate performance in late June.
What do you think it will actually take for Joe Biden to stand aside at this point?
It will foremost take two things. Number one, it'll take his wife, the First Lady, Jill Biden. And given the relationship that Joe and Jill Biden have, if Jill, the First Lady, says, Joe, you need to step away, it's the right time to do it. All indications would be from anyone who has ever known Joe Biden, anyone who has ever worked with Joe Biden, that he will listen to her and he will heed her request. We don't have any indication or evidence at this point that she's done anything of that sort. But were that to happen, that would be a massive factor in the decision that he would make. And then finally, the ultimate decider is Joe Biden himself. And if he wants to stay in, if he wants to continue running for re-election, if he wants to go forward, nobody can force him, save something that would be just dramatic, almost beyond comprehension, which would be some sort of constitutional move by people in his own party to remove him from the presidency. And nobody is talking about that right now. So that's really where we stand. But the pressure campaign that has been put on Joe Biden by members of his own party, prominent members of his own party, sort of the aggregate force of all of that is something that he just simply can't ignore, and is only going to get larger and louder as the next hours and days go on.
If Biden does step down, the next most obvious candidate is his Vice President, Kamala Harris. What do we know about the polling between her and Donald Trump?
So yes, you're absolutely correct in that the likely choice for what would happen next would be for the vice president, Kamala Harris, to assume the mantle of the presidential candidate, which is something that would be possible, number one, and it wouldn't take too much doing relative to the other alternatives, which would, for example, to have an open convention in Chicago next month, when the Democrats will all meet, just as Republicans met this week in Milwaukee, to formally nominate a presidential candidate. There are other people whose names have been bandied about: the governor of California, the governor of Michigan. So you're going to hear a lot about Gavin Newsom and Gretchen Whitmer over the next few days, likely. But that seems to be a more unlikely scenario, at least at this juncture, than Kamala Harris going forward. But the party is going to have to decide that.
If Biden were to step down, would you expect it in the next 24 hours or Sunday? Would you care to make a prediction?
Well, the longer it continues, the more dissent and the more distrust and the more gnashing of teeth is going to take place within the Democratic Party, which is likely going to hurt their effort for doing what they ultimately want to do, which is beat Donald Trump in November and retain the White House, whether it's Joe Biden or somebody else. Also, too, we have to consider something that doesn't get talked about so much, at least as much as the presidency, which is the down ballot races, the races for the U.S. House, the races for the U.S. Senate, the two sides of Congress. And Democrats and Republicans have incredibly close margins right now, and either party could win either part of Congress. So that's incredibly important. And as we know from just the past several years, when you have divided government, well, that is really is really great for the party that doesn't have the White House, and it's really bad in the opposite direction. So there's a great incentive for the parties to also focus on that race. And if you have a presidential candidate who is unpopular or who is flagging or whose fortunes are going in the wrong direction, that can have a very, very notable halo effect on those down ballot races and could very well make the difference between one party or another gaining power in the Congress, House, or Senate.
What was your most memorable moment from the Republican convention this week?
Oh, you're putting me on the spot. I mean, some actually occurred outside of the convention hall, to be honest. A kind of a little open secret about national political conventions is that the inside of the convention hall, that's where all the pomp and circumstances, that's where all the television cameras are, that's where everyone is giving the speeches. But I witnessed some executives of corporations who were, not announced anywhere, wheeling and dealing with politicians, or a lot of sort of proverbial smoky backroom conversations that were taking place. There's a great amount of political influence that gets peddled at conventions like this.
Dave Levinthal, editor-in-chief of Raw Story, joining us live from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee there. That's it for this episode of The Briefing, and it feels like deja vu, but as we mentioned last week, we'll be keeping a very close eye on what happens in the race to the presidency in the United States in the coming days and weeks, so keep checking your feed for the latest analysis from us. And something totally different coming your way for the weekend briefing tomorrow. Antoinette is joined by Artistic Director of Bangarra Dance Theatre, Frances Rings. She's speaking on the importance of using your body for movement and what professional dancers think of TikTok. That'll be in your feed tomorrow, and we'll upload the interview to YouTube in full. Just search Listener Newsroom and hit that subscribe button. And if you like what you hear from us, please share it with your friends. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you soon.